The challenge that the Trump administration is trying to put forth on the birthright citizenship is not really about Native people. They're just using us because there is a case that suggests that we weren't entitled to birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And you know why? Because we were excluded. And and this is where I go back to again, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Because we weren't. In 1868, we were not US citizens. We lived in very distinct communities. Now, some of our people had ventured off out of our communities and were living amongst white people, and they were actually looked at a little differently. And I'll talk about that in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, because in Section 2, what it says is representatives. This is about the apportionment clause. This is to address the three-fifths compromise from the original Constitution. And it says representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. Now, the reason they don't just say Indians, and the reason they say Indians not taxed, because there is a distinction. When they say Indians not taxed, they are actually talking about Native people who live within Native communities that are not a part of the rest of so-called American society, because we're living within a distinct region, we're living distinct lives, and we're living, for the most part, independent of the United States and of the Constitution. That's why in the Articles of Confederation, in the original U.S. Constitution, and even in 1868, almost 100 years later, they are still using that expression, Indians not taxed, because they are looking at, when they're, the reason they say we're not taxed is because we weren't participating in any of the taxing schemes of the United States, because we were living in a distinct Native community. So this gets into one of the issues that they kept talking about, which was domicile and domiciliation. I didn't even know domiciliation was a word, but this is what was being debated by these guys, because somewhere along the line, the Solicitor General for the United States, the guys arguing Trump's position on this thing, was saying where a person lived and where they intended to live was a factor in whether they were entitled to birthright citizenship. Now, it doesn't say that anyplace in here. And the only people where there's any question about domiciliation is tied into both that subject to the jurisdiction, because living in our communities, we weren't subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So it doesn't really detail this idea of domiciliation and where we lived, but that's what it means. And the Indians not taxed, again, it's referring to a distinct, the vast majority of our people, by the way, who were still living in our distinct communities and not commingling and coexisting within American society the way some Native people had. I mean, so I think it's important, because all of this conversation about where a person is domiciled, it doesn't say anything in the Constitution referring to anybody else. And let me say this one other thing. Native people are the only distinct group of people that are distinguished in the Constitution, separate from anybody else. They don't talk about Frenchmen. They don't talk about Englishmen. They don't talk about the Spanish. They don't talk about black folks. They don't talk about people of African descent or coming from immigrants from Haiti or from any place else. They always talk about persons. And in persons, the only thing they did in the original Constitution was distinguish between free persons, and they never said enslaved. They said free persons, and then all others would be counted as three-fifths. So there's no place, they don't say men or women, they don't distinguish between anybody. The only people who are distinguished as a distinct group of people and mentioned in the Constitution are Native people. And were mentioned twice in the Constitution and then included in one other place of the Constitution. And I've said this multiple times, but I'll say it again. We are mentioned in the Apportionment Act, both in the original Constitution and in the 14th Amendment, as being excluded, excluding Indians not taxed. So we weren't being counted. We weren't being counted in the 1790s when they passed the Constitution, and we weren't being counted in 1868 when they amended their Constitution on some of this birthright citizenship and apportionment stuff. We still were not being counted in 1868. So I and again, we were singled out. Indians not taxed. And of course, we were also put on par, regardless of what anybody else says or what other judges have said or courts have said, we were put on par with foreign nations in the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among several states, and with Indians. Not of Indians, not of foreign nations. It was a little bit more of or among. It did reserve the power to regulate commerce between the states, but when it came to foreign nations and Indian tribes, it says that they were regulating their people in the commerce that they conducted with us. They weren't. They were not regulating our commerce or foreign nations' commerce. They were regulating their commerce with us. So to be clear, and of course, the other place that we were included, even though it's not mentioned specifically, is the treaty clause. Now, how do I know that we were included in the treaty clause? Because of the treaties. The United States entered into treaties with other nations, and they entered into hundreds. By some estimates, it's like 350 quote unquote Indian treaties the United States entered into. So that is all under the treaty clause, which, again, those treaties were supposed to be the supreme laws of the land, and we can debate that at length. But again, one of the points of contention in this whole debate over birthright citizenship entered domiciliation into the conversation. And to be clear, anybody who enters the United States is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, with the only exception are diplomats who come in from other nations purely as on diplomatic missions from other nations. And of course, we didn't enter the United States. We were here before the United States, so we aren't included either. But or we aren't necessarily subject to the jurisdiction either. So I wanted to address that specific because the irony is Trump used a native case in like that arose in the 70s. The courts basically suggested or ruled that Native people were not entitled to birthright citizenship, which we weren't, because the 14th Amendment excluded us both in apportionment and in citizenship. I mean, and I don't think there's any debate about that. The fact that Trump was trying to use a native case to somehow, single out and discriminate against brown people coming in from South America and other places is kind of absurd, almost on every level.